Can you please elaborate on why you advise against cohabitation before marriage?
Well, so why would I advise against cohabitation before marriage? Well, the simple answer to that question is there's plenty of evidence that it's a bad idea. And I just mean factual evidence to begin with, although I think there are other reasons. People who live together and then get married are more likely to get divorced, not less likely. And that's a really interesting fact because it flies in the face of what you might think of as a kind of pragmatic common sense, you know, because you might think, well, you don't buy a car without taking it out for a test drive. Right, and everyone laughs because that seems obvious. But then, you know, woman's not a car. And neither is a man. And really, like seriously, really not an object. And so it isn't obvious at all that that metaphor applies, even though it's at first shallow glance, it seems obviously true. Well, but if it's obviously true, then you might say, well, why are people who live together before they get married more likely to get divorced? And one possible answer to that is, well, people who are more likely to get divorced are the same people who are more likely to live together rather than to get married, and that's possible. It's very difficult to separate those two things out, but in some sense it doesn't matter. What the facts reveal is that if the goal is to learn what you need to learn so that you can decide who you should marry more effectively, or learn how to act if you do get married more effectively, and the goal is that your marriage will be better and last, then it doesn't work. And that's a strange truth. And then you might ask yourself, well, why? Why doesn't it work? It's also the case, by the way, that the more sexual partners, the larger the number of sexual partners that someone has had before they get married, the more likely they are to get divorced as well. And it's also the case, by the way, and this is also interesting. So I spent a lot of time studying criminal behavior in all sorts of different manifestations, some of it on the political front with regard to the behavior of people who committed terrible atrocities in the service of political belief, some of it on the frontier of criminal sadism itself. I spent a lot of time studying the behavior of serial killers and mass torturers and people like that. But I also spent a lot of time as a research scientist looking at what psychiatrists and psychologists know as antisocial behavior. And antisocial behavior is the pattern of behavior that characterizes criminals. And it usually makes itself manifest pretty early in life, perhaps as early as 2 years old, by the way. And once it's established, it's extremely stable. It isn't obvious at all that psychologists or psychiatrists have learned anything about how to remediate antisocial behavior, so criminal behavior, or its precursors in childhood. Once it's there, that especially seems to be the case after about 4 years of age. Once it's there, it's unbelievably stable and resilient and resistant to change. And it has a lot of different aspects, antisocial behavior. But one of the markers for antisocial behavior, delinquency, childhood conduct disorder, early onset criminality, is early sexual behavior and multiple partners. And so, you can take that for what it's worth. Why is that the case? You could speculate. someone who's oriented in a criminal direction is more likely to take advantage of someone else for their own gratification. I think that's the basic commonality. I don't know that for sure, because we don't know why these different symptoms of criminality, let's say, link together, apart from the fact that criminals are predators and the really pathological criminals are predatory parasites, and that's really what defines a psychopath, by the way, is a psychopath is a predatory parasite. The archetypal psychopath is a sadistic predatory parasite. So the sadist takes delight in the pain of others, so positive pleasure in the pain of others. The predator uses others to their own advantage, and the parasite takes no responsibility for his or her own existence and manipulates or compels others to serve that goal. And so that's kind of an ugly combination of traits, and one of the core elements of that is early multiple partner promiscuity. And so that's interesting, and that also might explain why more pre-marriage sexual partners increases the probability of divorce, is that it's a marker for the pattern of behavior that is characterized by the exploitation of others and is therefore more likely to be unsustainable over the medium to long run. So that's interesting. Then you could think about it, kind of think about it metaphysically. I thought about this, or philosophically, I thought about what are you telling someone when you live with them? Okay, so I've talked to lots of people, women who are cohabiting with men are generally not very happy about the fact that the relationship is not moving towards marriage. Now, I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Women seem to suffer more emotionally as a consequence of sexual activity outside of a committed relationship. You can imagine why that is. Women experience more negative emotion than men on average in general, but also women pay a much higher, sex is much riskier for women than it is for men, obviously. Hopefully I don't have to explain why that is. So women are often women who are cohabiting are often less than happy about that. And the men who I've talked to about that about their partner's displeasure with the current unstable nature of the relationship, often say something like, well, we don't need a piece of paper to indicate our commitment to each other, which sounds all revolutionary and Che Guevara, but which is really a pretty pathetic bit of reasoning. First of all, for someone to say that means they think that what they just said convinces you that all marriage is a piece of paper, and that's a preposterously foolish argument. I mean, at minimum, in the typical marriage ceremony, you make a vow by whatever is holy to you, or at least in front of the state itself, and then in front of your community as you define it, that you're going to make a commitment to someone. And if you think that's nothing, then you're probably the sort of person that the person you asked to marry you should run away from. So that's pretty shallow. And then you might ask, well, why do you need to commit to your partner in front of your community and a higher authority, let's say? And the answer is, well, life is really, really difficult, and you're going to have a rough time with your partner no matter how much you love them, because the two of you are different, and you're different sexually, and you're different temperamentally, and so you're not going to see eye to eye all the time, and then horribly difficult things are going to come your way, and the complexity of those difficult things is going to tempt you to pull apart. And exactly when pulling apart might be the worst possible thing for you, and maybe you need that vow before your community and God himself, let's say, or at least the state, and the vow that you've made to yourself and your partner, and the vow that you've made publicly to all your friends to keep you together when the going gets rough. And you might say, well, you don't need that. And I would say, well, that's just because the going hasn't got rough enough for you yet. Because when it does get that rough, you'll bloody well know that you needed that. That's for sure. And that will definitely happen to you. That will definitely happen to you if you marry someone, because all the things that life can throw at you will be thrown at you in the course of a marriage. And so the vow and the community commitment, you don't just throw that away casually. And you certainly don't say, well, that's just a piece of paper. You know, what do I need a piece of paper to validate my love? It's like, your love's that great, is it? You're really that much of a saint that this person, they can just, you say you love them and oh man, they're just done. They're in bliss. They're in paradise for the rest of their life. They can just rely, you're never going to waver. Now that you expressed your love, you're just going to be there 100% of the time. You don't need anyone else to help you. You don't need a vow. You don't need any tradition. Your love is so pure and holy that that other person, they can just rely on you from that second onward. No hesitation. It's like, yeah, right. That's just complete bloody rubbish. You can't even rely on yourself in relationship to yourself for that. So, okay, so next, what are you telling your partner? Well, as far as I can tell, if you live with someone, here's what you're saying to each other. You're the best I can manage at the moment. And maybe the same applies to me for you. And we both really don't want to take on any more responsibility than necessary. Plus, we both want to have the option of trading up if opportunity comes along. And so why don't we just make do with this provisional arrangement while we cast our eye out into the broader world and see if we can fish something better in. And, you know, you can say I'm cynical about that, but I don't think I'm cynical about that. Because living together means something like, well, we're not permanently committed, and not permanently committed means, well, we're impermanently committed, and impermanently committed means we're looking for a better commitment, or perhaps to be alone, but forget that, because that's usually not true. Well, what kind of basis is that to have a relationship with someone? How are you going to found a relationship on that? Especially an intimate relationship. How's that going to work? It's like, you'll do for now. I don't think that's a very solid foundation to move forward. To allow you to move forward. And then it's indeterminate too. It's, well, if you're just living together, do you have kids? Because that's a commitment, that's for sure, and that's a real commitment, or it better be, and it's going to be inevitably anyways. And so if there's ambiguity about your commitment to each other, there's going to be ambiguity about your plans for children, and that's a huge ambiguity in most relationships, and so that's not helpful. That just means neither of you know what the hell you're doing, and that provokes anxiety and uncertainty, and it decreases hope, because hope is experienced in relationship to a goal. And if the goal is ambiguous, maybe we'll have kids and maybe we'll not, well then there's no real hope there. And so that seems to be a pretty decent pathway to misery. So, and then the next issue is, and this is the final one that I'll discuss, is you're not married if you're living together. And so you might say, well, you're practicing being married. It's like, no, you're not. Why? Because it's not something you can simulate. So one of the things I learned from reading Carl Jung thought about marriage as a container, as a container for alchemical transformation, as a container that would produce a heat so intense that the base metal of your psyche could be transformed into something ideal. But it had to be a container that could take heat, because it requires heat to transform. And you might say, well, how much heat does someone as base as you need to transform? And the answer might be, a lot of heat. I need a lot of heat and pressure before I'm going to change, before I'm going to become purified in any real sense. And so what's the heat and pressure? Here's what it is. You don't get to run away. You're stuck with that person. And they're stuck with you. And you made a vow. It's like, uh-oh, I'm stuck with you. Just like I'm stuck with me. And the vow is exactly that, right? In some real sense. The vow is, I'm going to treat you like you're me. And you don't even like yourself very much. So that's a vicious vow. And so you might say, well, how desperate do you have to be when confronted by someone else to change your ways? And the answer might be, well, you have to be as desperate as being shackled to someone makes you. You know, one of the reasons that Tammy and I have got along and are still together is because we both know that we're stuck with each other. And so we decided quite a long time ago that we didn't want to have the same stupid fight every day for the next 40 years. And that's like the definition of a bad marriage. It's like we have the same fight every day for 40 years. That's hell. And so the alternative is, now let's just have a bloody fight right here and now and see if we can sort out whatever the hell is so stupid about us that's keeping us in this dismal hell. And why? Well, because otherwise we're just stuck with this misery. And if you can walk away and if you can leave, which you can if you're not bound together, then you're not going to withstand the horrible process of heat and pressure that's required to make you transform. You'll just walk around that. You'll just look for an excuse. I mean, people look for an excuse not to do that anyways. And so part of the reason you get married is so you're desperate enough to change. And maybe that doesn't even work. So those are the reasons that no, there's one more. There's one more. This is the next thing. It's a necessary act of faith. And, you know, in our culture, because we're not very wise, we think that faith means, especially when it's parodied as religious faith, we think faith means the willingness to suspend disbelief while swallowing a proposition that any fool would reject. That's often how the rationalist atheists view religious claims. Faith means the suspension of your rationality and the acceptance of an absurd claim. But that isn't what faith means. Not really. Faith is what makes movement into the unknown possible. And you need to move into the unknown because that's where you're moving. And because the unknown is unknown, because the future is unknown, you cannot step forward into the unknown without faith. It wouldn't be unknown if you knew it. If you knew it, it wouldn't require faith, but you don't know it. And so you step forward into the unknown future as a consequence of your faith in some principles. And if you love someone, if you fall in love with someone and you decide to marry them, you don't have the evidence at hand that that's the right person for you. What you have instead is the joint decision that come hell or high water, you're going to struggle forward together. And then you don't even know if that's the right decision. Because you're not going to know till you're till you've been married, like your whole life. You're not going to have the data. And so you do have to throw yourself into the abyss to be married. Just like you have to throw yourself into the abyss to be alive. You have to move forward in faith. And then you might say, well, how do you call the best out of yourself and out of your partner, that may be a partner that you're fortunate enough to love? And the answer might be by offering them the gift of faith. And by saying, look, flawed as we both are, if we commit to each other, we have the possibility of becoming more than we are. And I'd like to do that with you, even though there's no evidence that it's going to work. But then you might think too, the more deeply you're committed to that faith, the more likely it is to work. And you can't find out what that commitment is without the commitment, and so you can't simulate it by living together, because it's not real. It's not real until you make the commitment. And then I would also say, well, what if you don't make the commitment? Well, then you're not committed. And you might say, well, why should I be committed? Well, what's the alternative? It's to be uncommitted. Well, are you free then? Or are you just aimless and hopeless and confused? And you admire people who are committed to something. You sort of wish yourself, when you're feeling aimless and you feel that your life is meaningless, you might think, well, I really wish I was committed to something. Wouldn't it be nice to be committed to something? It's like, well, commit to something then. And you say, well, I don't have the evidence. It's like, you don't commit because of the evidence. You commit because of faith. And there's foolish faith, there's naive faith, and there's blind faith. And I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about staking your life on something that might work if you just, if God was willing, if the fate smiled on you and you put your whole soul into it. And that's what you do when you vow to stay faithful to someone. And you can't simulate that. It doesn't work. So there's like 5 reasons why it doesn't work. And I don't know if you find those reasons compelling or not, but I've thought about them a lot. And maybe there's a part of me that wishes that isn't how life was, and that you could just have a casual relationship with someone and then trade them in on someone better if they happen to come along. But I just don't believe that's delusional to believe that, at best. And it's like Machiavellian, psychopathic and narcissistic and criminal at worst.